Hello. Today we're going to be talking about System Manager Replication and how you can use it to update different products that connect to System Manager with the relevant configuration changes and administrative changes that you've made. To start with, let's just quickly touch on what exactly System Manager is. So the Avaya Aura System Manager is a centralized administration and web portal that you can use to configure your Avaya Aura core. So that's going to include all sorts of different Avaya products, Session Manager, Communication Manager, Avaya Aura Messaging. So basically, rather than each individual product being required to actually manage your environment, you can install a System Manager, and the System Manager is going to then be used to actually apply and update those different products. So you have a centralized single location to do all of this configuration from. Now, when it comes to actually sending or communicating these configuration changes to these various products, one of the processes that is used is this process of replication. And specifically, replication is used with products that primarily speak SIP. So that's going to include products like Session Manager, Avaya Aura Device Services, Breeze, and the System Manager, as well as the other products, will use something called the Data Replication Service on each of them to sort of manage that connection. When it comes to talking about replication between System Manager and another product, we generally will look at Session Manager as a starting point, as it is probably the most well-known example of an Avaya product that actually replicates with System Manager. Once again, just very quickly, Session Manager is Avaya's proxy and registrar server, so it handles all of your user registrations as well as all of your internal SIP routing. It basically sits in the middle of the SIP network and creates and manages all the different connections to the various SIP devices and servers within your environment. Now, one of the other reasons why Session Manager is very often spoken about in the same breath as System Manager when it comes to replication is because Session Manager itself doesn't really have a portal, an administrative portal that can be used to configure it. It relies pretty much solely on the System Manager to provide that functionality. So as a result of that, the Session Manager and System Manager replication process tends to be pretty stable because it's been in place for a very, very, very long time. Now, one particular thing that is worth mentioning here is whenever a new Session Manager is deployed or installed, one of the very last steps that you are going to be asked to do as part of that installation process is to provide the Session Manager with all of the important details for its accompanying System Manager. Once again, the Session Manager really can't be configured without a System Manager, so setting up the System Manager details at the end of your Session Manager's installation process is basically required. Once the Session Manager has the System Manager's IP address information, FQDNs, once that initial installation process is completed, Session Manager will actually request its configuration from the System Manager. Now, one other sort of side note here is that generally speaking, when you're dealing with replication, you're going to have some sort of change that you have implemented for a particular product. For example, maybe you're adding in a new user. Normally, this process goes in sort of one direction from the System Manager down to whichever the particular product is going to be, Session Manager, for example. During the initial install of Session Manager, and really of any product that is going to replicate with System Manager, that initial install will be sort of the one time when the adopting products that use replication will make a request for their configuration. After that, it's pretty much only going to be System Manager pushing data down kind of on its own as a starting point. When you deal with the initial install, Session Manager, AADS, Breeze, that initial installation process will be the one time when those adopting products will actually make a request for their configuration. When it comes to how replication is sort of managed, at least from a web interface point of view, there are a couple of key definitions that we want to just quickly touch on, and that's the idea of a replica group and a replica node. As the name implies, a replica group is going to be used to, well, group together or categorize together different products with their specific releases. So for example, if you had, say, a session manager at release, say, 8.1 and another session manager at release 10.1, those two individual session manager servers, despite the fact that they are the same product, because they have different releases, they would be grouped in two separate replica groups. Both of the replica groups would be labeled as session manager replica groups, but they are further categorized by their release level. So if you're in the replication element within System Manager, you'll first see all of the different replica groups that have been created. If you click on one of these replica groups, you'll see all of the various products within that particular group. Again, groups are defined by both the specific product, Session Manager, Breeze, as well as their version. So each individual group will have one or more replica nodes, and the replica nodes simply represent one specific server or element. Now, as I mentioned before, during the initial installation of an adopting product that uses replication, you will have that adopting product make a request from System Manager to pull across that configuration, their new configuration. But from basically that point forward, any time there is some sort of configuration or administrative change that is needed, that change will be processed by the System Manager. System Manager will save that change into its local database, and it will then push that new change down to the respective element for which the change was made. For example, if you create a brand new user in System Manager, you set up all of their different communication profiles. Let's say that there is a Session Manager profile included. The particular session managers that are included within that profile will then have that information replicated down to them automatically by the System Manager. So this replication process, after the initial setup, is all going to be automatically handled. The System Manager will accept the change, process it, and then push it down to the particular servers or elements that need that information. Just a quick side note here on the fact that System Manager can be connected to other products, not just those that primarily speak SIP. You can also have your System Manager connect to a LDAP server or potentially a communication manager. And both of those particular types of products, an LDAP server, Active Directory server, or a communication manager, they can both replicate with a System Manager, but the particular processes that they use are different. So it's not true replication for an LDAP server or a communication manager. In the case of CM in particular, it uses a synchronization process, which again does have sort of similar logic that is applied to it. However, the synchronization process that's used between System Manager and CM is not automatic. And similarly, the process of directory synchronization, which is how System Manager and an Active Directory server communicate with one another, is about getting information into the System Manager, as opposed to pushing that information out of System Manager. So putting all of this together, replication is the process by which System Manager is able to update, configure, administer primarily SIP-only devices with new and updated configuration. So again, when a new user is created in System Manager, if that user is going to be registering into a Session Manager, that information will be replicated from the System Manager down to the Session Manager. The data replication service that I mentioned before is basically the backbone that handles this process. It's how System Manager is able to send information down to a replica node, and it's how that replica node lets System Manager know that it's received new configuration. There are other products that System Manager can replicate with. However, they use slightly different processes. In the case of CM, it uses the synchronization process. And in the case of an LDAP server like Active Directory, it uses directory synchronization. And again, those processes are logically a little bit different in terms of their behavior. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for this session. We will see you in the next one.